Okay, part 2 of Little Tiny Fish. Here we go. So this is the Conodon animal as reconstructed. Just to complete the last part. All right, so let's go on. Now there are a bunch of very weird jawless fish right down near the bottom, totally extinct today. Very strange looking, really interesting, I think. First, the ostracoderms. So ostracoderms look like this. They're kind of similar to placoderms in that we've got armoring at the front, and then we've got sort of a cartilaginous body inside. Some of these are going to feature sort of spikes that would maybe stop other animals from eating them. Because as you saw in the video of the placoderm skull, remember on the inside of it, there you had the imprint of where the brain would sit on the inside of the skull, and there's no bone covering it. So it was apparently only covered with some sort of tissue, maybe like a little cartilage layer, maybe some sort of connective tissue, which would mean that if a placoderm bit down on something that was spiky, that spike could potentially go up and pierce its brain. This is what people have reconstructed. I think maybe that's going to change in the future with more finds, but that's where the state is right now of the art. And so these are ostracoderms. Yeah, nice cartilaginous body with an armored front end. The thing about these that's weird is that these are jawless fish, whereas placoderms have a jaw, and that is also part of their front armor. That's really the big difference, at least in terms of appearance. There are differences in the way their brains look and work. There are all kinds of other differences, but yeah, a very strange looking group of early fish. Okay, then we get to the jawed fish, and the idea, I believe, still is that the first gill arch, which is basically like where our ribs would be, that is going to, through alteration, presumably during development, end up being used, and sort of the head can move down against this. So as if you were chewing by doing that, is the way I would think of it. These are the development of the first jaws, and so some of the first jawed animals are placoderms, and some of the others are chondrichthyans, which are sharks. That's our cartilage fish name. So let's have a look. Here is the idea of the evolution of jaws. So you would have a gill, you would have a support around the gills, and then the support would morph and become the jaw. The support around the gills would also morph and become something like rib cage, yeah, which is there to support and protect your lungs, which are a modified version of a gill, essentially, in terms of development. So yeah, that's the idea. And this comes from some of the first jawed animals, and it's also based in part on developmental biology, like where certain developmental genes are turned on. That's a subject where I am not expert at all, and so we'll leave that for another class, if that's all right. But let's talk placoderms, because placoderms are great. So placoderms are going to be like our Dunkleosteus up here. It's these two fighting each other, like, oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm sure there's enough fish in the sea for both of you, yeah. Yeah, you find these things, placoderms in the Silurian. They go extinct by the end of the Permian. They started getting weird by the end. They do really well in the Devonian, Silurian and Devonian, and then they started to get usurped by some other kinds of fish later on. Yeah, mainly marine, but there aren't that many freshwater fish fossils. There aren't that many freshwater fossils in general compared to marine fossils, Oceans were huge. You can roughly tell where the coastline is. It's easier to look for these. It's kind of rare to find freshwater, but there are, yeah, excellent freshwater fish deposits. I believe the old red sandstone that you get over in Scotland would be one of those. And there's a wonderful array of fish that you find inside of that. Yeah, and so these filled placoderms in general. They have this sort of armored head and basically no other armoring. The rest is just presumably scales of some sort. But they filled a bunch of different ecological niches. So there were little tiny prey placoderms, great big predator placoderms, placoderms with a bit of armament, trying not to get eaten. Yeah, just a nice little range of these, doing all the things that fish do. Which, if you look at modern fish, there are a few sharks out there, yeah, sure, but most of them are these bony fish, and yeah, they've also evolved to fill in and do a whole bunch of different things, from giant tunas and swordfish down to little tiny minnows. So there you go. Here's a reconstruction of the Dunkleosteus, and thankfully they have it tilted so you can't see how long it is, because this is before they figured out how long it should have been. Here is a little sort of flat placoderm fish. This is the famous Dunkleosteus skull. This is the first one. It was recovered, if I remember correctly, from a bunch of individual nodules. I want to say it's from the Cleveland Shale or something very close to that up in Cleveland, Ohio. This is the pride and joy of the Natural History Museum up there. And there are many, many reproductions of this in museums around the world. I think the original is just in Cleveland, though. So, yeah, there you go. All right, go up there, visit, see what it looks like. Here are some of the plates. And so these are not exactly analogous to the plates that will become the plates of later tetrapod skulls, for example. This is a different branch of evolution, and they're not even all that closely related to other things that come before or after. Placoderms are kind of their old thing. So they, yeah, they've given names to the various parts here, and there we go. This is actually exceptional preservation, where you get all these in 3 dimensions, where you can see everything. And from some of these, they can actually scan them, and like from that brain impression, you can reconstruct some of the brains. And there's even some where they have exceptional preservation that preserves some muscle tissue or some brain tissue. Here's an example. So this is some preserved soft tissue from in a placoderm, and we've got some muscle blocks, basically. And yeah, saying a fish had muscles, to swim is kind of a basic thing to say, but it's really cool to be able to see this. And I think maybe the more interesting thing is some of these where they can see where some of the blood vessels go, and how these are different in different groups of fish. They're a really good diagnostic feature that is rarely preserved or rarely accessible on a lot of fossils. Okay, next group. Put the placoderms aside, and there's the idea that placoderms may have been either a sister group of the chondrichthyans. I don't think there's serious consideration that they evolved from, the chondrichthyans evolved from placoderms, because they appear fairly early in the Devonian, although I thought there were some traces of them earlier, but because they have cartilaginous bones instead of fully ossified calcium phosphate bones, they do not fossilize as well. What you tend to get would be the teeth. But yeah, you get these things appearing in the Devonian. They kind of push out placoderms. They're one of the groups that pushes out placoderms. Get a bunch of them in the Carboniferous. People are always looking for shark teeth at the sites where we will normally hunt fossils. Yeah, these guys are going to have usually a heterocircle tail. So it's going to be big on top, little on the bottom, kind of like that. And if you've ever seen a shark, just think back to one. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what a shark tail looks like. Absolutely. Within the chondrichthyes, there are a lot of very different things. So your chimera fish, your true sharks, rays, skates, yeah, all kinds of crazy looking fish. United by common descent, but these guys got to start really early, and they've kind of just kept going. It's an evolutionary success story in a way. There are other much more prominent groups of fish now, but sharks are definitely still in the mix, or chondrichthyans are definitely still in the mix. So good job. Yeah. Here is a fossil mystery, kind of an interesting one. So people were finding these things. It's like a little spiral array of teeth, and trying to figure out what the heck is this? What does this mean? Um, the only sort of creatures that would have teeth around this time seem to be sharks, and so they're saying, okay, it's probably a shark. We probably don't have preservation of the rest of it, and so people reconstructed it. Look at all these different ways. It's like a little tail ornament, like a tail club, toothy tail club. Elephant snout decoration on top, big long sort of derp tongue down there, tucked in the bottom jaw way back here. Oh, look at that one sticking way out on a long jaw. Yeah, all more or less wrong, but not known until this specimen, which looks like it's just the teeth, was actually x-rayed. And when they x-rayed it, they figured out that there was actually some soft tissue preservation around the teeth. And so they could see that, oh, this is the skull. They could find where the eyes are, for example, and where the brain fit. Here is the lower jaw. It's nice and thin. Everything's nice and thin. And so this was sort of curled up in there. And so it's basically coming out of the lower jaw. Because they found the tissue around it to actually help make sense of that. So the spiral is like growing from the inside, and presumably only these parts that are out here would actually be available for chopping up food. It's a weird looking shark only because there aren't any sharks that really look like this with that sort of sideways spiral jaw these days, but I thought you'd like that. That's kind of a weird, interesting one. Here are megalodon teeth, and these are from it's a nice study where they think they found a nursery for these megalodon sharks. And these little tiny megalodon sharks that are like 7 to 14 feet long, if I remember right, are there, but then the sharks get much, much bigger. And they find a lot of their little teeth. So it was like a little lagoon. And it appears that the adults came in. Most of the teeth that are there are just from juveniles. And so it looks as though this was a sort of nursery. And these are teeth, little baby teeth that fell out as the sharks were growing. Didn't even necessarily die. They would just shed their teeth like modern sharks and replace it. So think of the way that sharks have like sets of teeth behind their teeth that keep coming forward. That's kind of like that one with the spiral jaw. Same idea, except that they're just putting all their money into one set of teeth that's doing that. So yeah, extreme version of a fairly normal thing. And in this formation, they're saying, hey, at this Gatun formation, we tend to get these little tiny, they're measuring the crown width and height of the teeth, these little tiny teeth. And they found another area where there's kind of a mix of very young sharks and some juvenile sharks in the fossil record at that spot. And then they've got other sites where it's mostly the adult sharks that are out there. And so, as some modern sharks do, they think there were little nurseries, maybe in protected lagoons, where the little baby megalodons could swim around and learn how to catch fish and stuff like that in a relatively safe, sheltered environment before going out in the open ocean and being just an absolute terror of the seas. So, good for you, megalodons. Yeah, and this is showing the number of juvenile teeth as opposed to adult teeth that they found at this particular site. And based on the tooth size and which tooth it is, they can calculate the length of the megalodons. And so these lengths are in meters, and so when you're seeing 3 meters, that's like 9 or 10 feet. Yeah, so that's neat. And these are the neonatal sharks. They're just little tiny babies, little tiny 10-foot long megalodon sharks. Then you get the juveniles, which was that middle population. I think they were mostly in purple. And so those are going to be up to 10 meters in length, assuming that everything is proportionate to a modern great white shark, which is probably fairly close because they are fairly close. And then some of the adults would go up to not quite 20 meters, so not quite 60, 70 feet of fish, just a little bit less than that. Yeah. We don't want to get carried away. Okay, next group to evolve are going to be the bony fish. These are the osteichthyes, like osteoporosis, whatever. Osteo is bone, so and ichthyes is going to mean fish. So chondrichthyes is like chondrocytes are the ones that make cartilage fish, and these are bony fish. So these are going to actually mineralize their skeleton. They're going to have proper calcium phosphate mineralization like a good vertebrate should, and they're not just going to keep it in their teeth for a change. They're going to have jaws, and they're going to have paired fins, so on either side of the body. Some of the earliest ones, and it's still kind of debatable where these things fall, are the acanthodians, which we'll show you on the next slide. They're really cool looking. They've been called spiny sharks. They're really not that close to sharks, but they do have these spines. And so everywhere that there's a fin, there's actually a rigid bone spine that is going to be sticking out. And so you can see these, yeah, here are the big spines coming off the body, and here are some different kinds, yeah. So acanthodians usually will only leave behind their spines because the spines were heavily mineralized, and that is usually the only part of them that you will see, but that is evidence that they are there. And some of these things were massive. Some of these spines were kind of like this wide around and very long, so they got big, very, very big. Okay, so acanthodians are going to have still the heterocircle tail, but they will have the paired fins on the bottom side in particular. Just single fins on the top, and some of these fins will have, instead of like a little ray of something like bone, they will have just a big long spike of something more like a tooth. Yeah, something like bone, actually. The idea is that these are an anti-predator measure, and as you can see, the way these things point backwards, they're trying to fend off somebody that is attacking from the rear. These are like tail guns in World War II bombers. They're just trying to, yeah, keep the bogeys off the tail, basically. These have been considered to be a specific anti-placoderm defense. It's debatable, and I guess it would have worked for most anything. Nobody wants to eat a giant spine that's going to dig into your mouth, but yeah, that's intriguing if this was a result of an arms race between acanthodians and placoderms. Here is the brain case of a little acanthodian fish, and yeah, from Kansas, and so you can see the shape of the little brain in there. And this is one where it doesn't look like much on the surface, but by x-raying this and digitizing this, they're able to actually get a different signal from the bone than from the rock around it, because it's differently mineralized. It's going to have that phosphate in there. And from that, they're able to reconstruct the actual shape of the brain, which is really cool looking. Look at that. Yeah, neat little brain. And so there, yeah, you're kind of looking at it as a little nasal capsule. The eyes would be coming off at the side. All right, so trying to figure out where these things fit involves a lot of matrices. Just like we studied character matrices back a couple of weeks ago, they're going to measure these bones, lots of different points on the bones. They're going to measure their relative positions, and based on that, actually build up a phylogeny. And from this, they would say that chondrichthyans, which are going to be are sharks. They're going to be their own branch, and they're all related to each other, so that's great. Up here, you're going to have some other creatures. So these are going to be some of your sort of armored jawless fish. You're going to have some of your placoderms up in here as well. And then down here are the osteichthyan fish, the ones with bones. And so this particular reference would put acanthodians down as a group of primitive, like crown fish, bony fish. So there we go. Okay, the early bony fish, osteichthyans. So there's going to be a big class of these called Actinopterygii, and these are going to be the ray fin fishes. That's almost everything that you are going to see. And we don't need to know the groups that are coming from that. They're going to come in and kind of replace the group, the Paleonisciforms. There's a fish called Paleoniscus. It's pretty common in the Jurassic, if I remember right. You get a lot of those on the Jurassic coast in England. And this is a sort of a primitive fish, only weakly mineralized bones, but its architecture is similar to the sort of fish that you would catch in a stream or an ocean around here now. Yeah, this group is going to include some real weirdos like paddlefish. Have you seen those with a great big long sort of flat nose? Very rare river fish, if I remember correctly. These are also going to have heterocercal tails, and they're going to have ganoid scales made of ganoine, which is a particular material that's going to make up their scales. So they're going to have these big sort of diamond-shaped scales usually. As time goes on, you're going to see loss of these ganoine scales. So if you ever catch something like a garfish or a sturgeon, I believe those still have the ganoid scales, whereas those would not be what you would find on a bass, for example. We'll get to what their scales are made of in just a moment. But from the early fish, like some of those, like a garfish or something that look really primitive, some of those are still going to have the heterocercal tail, which is the tail that's like this, that's like our Dunkleosteus tail, right up there. Beep, 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 beep. Yeah, sort of triangular asymmetrical tail. They're going to evolve toward the homocercal tail, which is just usually about like that. So two roughly even lobes. Yeah, and the primitive ones are going to include gars and bowfins. That's great. Let's get a look at some of these weirdos. And I believe somewhere in the pictures, the author of this slide set is actually there holding one of these fish. So these are some of these very early fish. That's an actual Paleonisciform fish. Our little paddlefish. Here's a great big whopping gar. There's a sturgeon fish, just so you know what we're talking about. Bashir, you can get these in your fish tank if you want. Bowfin, you see we're still heterocercal. We haven't, but this one is actually pretty close to a homocercal tail. It's on the way, yeah. And then you get your teleost fish, and these are pretty much everything that your uncle who likes fishing would consider to be a fish, yeah. And these are the most common fish that are around now. So they're still ray finned. They've got these little rays in there, which are like miniature versions of the acanthodian great big spine. They just had one giant spine, and now we have lots of little tiny spines that hold these fins upright. It's maybe not as big a difference as it seems in the fossil record. Right. Now, totally separate from those, we've got the class Sarcopterygians. These are the ones that include the lobe-finned fishes, and these include basically everything that is leading up to tetrapods, which would include us. So all of the land animals are going to come from these. And so the famous one is going to be the coelacanth fish, which we showed some divers playing around with one earlier. These are going to have cosmoid scales made of cosmine, which is similar to dentin, which is what makes up our teeth. And so that's the scales of these coelacanth fish. Here's a phylogenetic tree to try and put all of this in here. So you're going to start out with your things like lampreys, Petromyzontiformis, and remember there was Meomyzon was the Carboniferous lamprey from the Tully Monster lecture. Or if you haven't watched that one yet, wait for it. The Heterostraci are going to be these with armoring on the top and bottom, but only on the head, and they are jawless fish, but they are jawless, highly protected fish. And so these are presumably going to be feeding on very small things, and they may be predators, but just of little tiny stuff. Then you got your placoderms, which are going to fill a bunch of different ecological niches, but we think of them as like Dunkleosteus, as these big predators. Armored just on the head. Interesting thing about this is that there's actually a little gap here in the armoring. So the bottom jaw, we think, mostly stayed in place, and they actually opened their top jaw. It's like set up to lift. So if you imagine chewing by keeping your bottom jaw there and moving your head up and down like that. Weird way to do it, but equally effective, I suppose. And so this is perhaps a conceit to them being an early member of the group actually having jaws, and with the jaw being recently derived from essentially like a rib, effectively, or some of the other bones that go around the face. Here are your acanthodians, which are the extinct spiny sharks. And some phylogenies put them here next to chondrichthyes. Some put them over here a little closer to osteichthyes. And I think their position will continue to become clearer as new studies are done. But then the osteichthyans are going to include all the actinopterygian fish, the regular ray-finned fish, and they're also going to include sarcopterygian fish, which is going to include groups like tetrapod ancestors. And so, if we're fish, and I guess we are if we're calling all of these things fish, then we're part of this group. We're part of the osteichthyes, but particularly the sarcopterygii of the osteichthyes. So there you go. Now you have a name for it. Yeah, do with that what you will. The extant Sarcopterygii, they're two big orders, and they have different names. We don't need to know about those. But we've got lungfish here. Look at those. And so these, I believe, are going to be distinguished by having the ability to breathe out of water as well as in water. So they're going to be, we think, similar to creatures like a Tiktaalik, which we think is one of the first animals to be able to lead a kind of a semi-land-based or nearly land-based lifestyle, maybe at least with its head out of the water lifestyle. Here are coelacanths. This is the other big branch there, and they have a great fossil record, and there are not many of them left now. Look at that very unusual tail with the extra little lobe sticking out at the back. And the really interesting part would be if you were to dissect one of these fins, which you shouldn't, because they're nice fish. Be kind to them. But that's where you would find the bones that are analogous to, and actually homologous to, the bones that make up our limbs in the forelimbs and hind limbs. Yeah, so here are these bones, and so here's our humerus, there's their humerus, here's our ulna and radius, there's their ulna and radius, and then instead of having weird little wrist bones that are hooked up like this, they're going to have weird little wrist and finger bones that are hooked up like that. Essentially, it is like you put a human hand inside of a mitten. It's just, all the same equipment on the inside. It's just that there's no separation between these. So we're not separating into individual digits. That's the thing that happens with some of the early amphibians. They start to get these sort of webbed feet, but where you can flex out the different digits, which would help for support on the land, is the idea. Yeah. And then there are changes that have to occur in the hip bones, basically how those lock together, and the shoulder bones to allow for this sort of very unnatural putting a bunch of weight underneath you and standing up, which are things that you really don't need to do so much in the water. Yeah. All right. Anyway, that was a very brief tour of fish evolution. Hope you liked it. And I wish we had more fish fossils to show you. Thanks a lot.